Some places hide darkness behind the most ordinary faces, ordinary homes, and ordinary towns. What if the person you trusted most was the one you should have feared the most? From a respected police officer who became the devil in the Ozarks, to a mother who abandoned her newborn, to a grandmother who buried her tenants in her backyard. These are cases so shocking, they feel almost like horror movies. If you like videos like these, please like the video and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It helps more than you know. And today, we're diving deep into some of the most disturbing true crime cases ever recorded. Let's begin. Grant Hardin, the devil in the Ozarks. The Ozarks are a forested mountain region spanning 4 states: Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Known for their rolling hills, shimmering lakes, and small towns, the Ozarks are well regarded as one of the most beautiful places in the United States. It also hosts some of America's deadliest animals: bears, mountain lions, copperhead snakes. But for the residents of Benton County, Arkansas, these were distant dangers, easily avoided. If you stuck to the main roads, you'd rarely encounter wildlife, at least none that could kill you. Little did they know, a predator stalked the back roads of Benton County for over 2 decades, and no one noticed, because this predator was hiding in plain sight. On a cold Sunday morning in November of 1997, 27-year-old schoolteacher Amy Harrison walked through the open doors of Frank Tillery Elementary in Rogers, Arkansas. In the school cafeteria, 250 worshipers were having their weekly service, but Amy wasn't there to pray. She had come in early to create a lesson plan for the week ahead. Once she'd gotten some work done, she headed down the hall to the teacher's lounge. Inside, a masked gunman was waiting. He wore a stocking pulled over his face and dark glasses to hide his eyes. He levels a pistol at her head and orders her into a more secluded room, the bathroom. He then proceeded to brutally assault her. How long it lasted is unknown. What we do know is that after this assault in the bathroom, he dragged her to another part of the school to assault her again, and afterwards, he fled. Police were called to investigate, but there was little to be done. Whoever this perpetrator was, he knew what the police would be looking for, and he made sure they wouldn't find it. Investigators created a police sketch in the hopes that someone would recognize the vague features of the masked man and collected a DNA sample, but with no other clues, their only course was to wait and hope that someone would come forward. Shortly after, the case went cold, until nearly 2 decades later, when the masked man would strike again. February 23rd, 2017, Benton County, Arkansas. James Appleton, a 59-year-old water department employee and volunteer firefighter, was pulled over onto Gan Ridge Road between Garfield and Pea Ridge, taking a phone call from his brother-in-law. According to the closest to James, he was a pillar in his small community, the type of man you couldn't say anything negative about, a loving father, grandfather, and husband. He was, by all accounts, universally liked and respected among his peers. But unfortunately for James Appleton, his fate was already sealed. Local resident John Bray was driving down Gan Ridge Road when he reported hearing a loud bang. He turned his car around and discovered Appleton sitting in his pickup truck, slumped over the steering wheel. By the time paramedics arrived, Appleton was already gone, killed instantly by a single gunshot wound to the head. Witnesses reported seeing a white Dodge Charger leaving the area at the time of the shooting, and investigators worked quickly to identify the car, checking traffic cameras and home surveillance systems in the days that followed the crime. After gathering the evidence, police came to a startling conclusion. They knew the killer. Born in 1968 in Bentonville, Arkansas, Grant Douglas Hardin seemed like your everyday kid. He was a student leader in his church, a member of the National Honor Society, and a star pupil in ROTC. He played basketball, went hunting, and lifted weights after school. One teacher described him as an honest Christian boy, with all the qualities of a good police officer. The kind of boy you'd expect to be wearing a badge one day. But there was something off about Grant Hardin. Once he got a police badge, he couldn't seem to hide his true colors. Hardin was hopping between police departments all across Benton County, Fayetteville, Huntsville, and Eureka Springs. With each new district, a new flurry of complaints would quietly roll in. Excessive force used, angry and unprofessional, poor performance reviews. Behind the scenes, he was fighting with his supervisors, lying on incident reports. He couldn't take criticism. He was constantly lashing out. But the Benton County Police Department kept him on the payroll and kept his behavior a secret. Because of this, Hardin's unsettling behavior never reached the public conscience, and in 2009, he was elected constable, and later, police chief, a job he resigned from months later, leaving under odd circumstances. And it was Grant Hardin's vehicle they'd seen on the traffic footage. After obtaining a search warrant for his home, they discovered even more evidence, including the murder weapon. There was no question, Grant Hardin was the killer. Police obtained an arrest warrant for Grant Hardin on suspicion of first-degree murder. Grant Hardin reportedly had one last dinner with his family on the night before his arrest. His wife and daughter, two more victims of the terrible crime he had committed. The next day, officers located Hardin and took him into custody without incident. He was read his rights and transported to the county jail to await formal charges. Upon arrival at central booking, police took a DNA sample from Hardin, and when they ran it against their database, they had a match, and the result was shocking. Almost 2 decades earlier, Grant Hardin was the unknown perpetrator who had snuck into Frank Tillery Elementary School and assaulted schoolteacher Amy Harrison. After 20 long years, they had found their man. The murder of James Appleton and the brutalizing of Amy Harrison painted a clear picture for prosecutors. The man, the persona they all knew, was a carefully crafted deception made to disguise the dark underbelly of a dangerous man, a monster who would finally face justice. In October of 2017, Grant Hardin pled guilty to first-degree murder for the killing of James Appleton. When asked at trial why he had committed these heinous crimes, he gave no reasoning, instead choosing to apologize, saying, "I don't know how to say it, but I'm sorry." Amy Harrison, who had the opportunity to address him in court, said, "I'm not a victim. I didn't deserve this. This was you, and you deserve to go to prison." Grant Hardin was sentenced to a combined 80 years in prison, with 10 years suspended due to a plea agreement, with the possibility of parole after 21 years served. Hardin was transferred to North Central Unit Prison in Calico Rock, Arkansas. At the age of 52, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. And for Amy Harrison and James Appleton, they would finally receive justice. Until 6 years later, when the unthinkable happened. Grant Hardin escaped. Guards and policemen frantically tried to locate Hardin in and around the prison, but to no avail. He had simply vanished. How did this happen? How was Hardin able to escape custody? Shortly thereafter, they got their answer. Working on a kitchen loading dock, Hardin used a marker to dye his shirt black, and an old soup can to fashion a crude police badge. With this makeshift disguise, he made his way to an unlocked gate just beyond the loading dock, and disappeared into the Ozarks. Law enforcement mobilized on a massive scale. Hundreds of officers began this massive manhunt. On the ground, canine units swept the woods, while patrol cars scoured city streets. Roadblocks choked the highways leading in and out of the county. Helicopters flew low, day and night, scouring the woods for any sign of Grant Hardin. Authorities quickly put up wanted posters and issued a warning to the public. Lock your doors and your vehicles. Supervise your children or keep them inside. Report anything out of place and maintain caution. Across Arkansas, the story broke like wildfire, and panic spread to neighboring counties. Reporters referred to him as the devil in the Ozarks. Beneath every headline, there was one sentiment that persisted. Grant Hardin wasn't free. He was loose, and no one would be safe until he was captured. With every day that passed, the worry of Arkansas citizens turned to unadulterated fear. They urged their officials to do more, and so the FBI and U.S. Border Patrol joined the search. Still, there was no sign of Hardin. Stone County Sheriff Brandon Long, in an interview with reporters, stated, "I am very scared that this guy is going to hurt or kill somebody before this is over with." Then, just 2 weeks after the search began, K-9 units picked up Hardin's scent 1.5 miles northwest of the prison, deep in the forest of Calico Rock. They fanned out, rifles at the ready, and marched into the woods. At approximately 3 p.m., officers spotted Hardin hiding in the brush. They raised their guns and demanded he surrendered. Hardin, seeing the massive force, made a lazy attempt at fleeing, but with the pressure on, it was no use. He stopped running, and police closed in. Fingerprint analysis confirmed his identity, and he was retaken into custody. After Hardin's escape, the Arkansas Department of Corrections carried out an internal investigation, uncovering serious security failures, including his misclassification and insufficient supervision. As a result, 2 prison staff members were dismissed, and tighter security protocols were put into place. Local authorities reported that Amy Harrison, Hardin's first victim, was appalled, concerned, and disappointed by the incompetence of the prison officials who allowed Hardin to escape. As of today, Grant Hardin is charged with escape under Arkansas state law. He has pleaded not guilty, and the trial is scheduled for November of 2025. Whatever the outcome of the case, the people of Arkansas can rest easy knowing that the devil of the Ozarks will never terrorize their roads, ever again. Geauga child. Crime happens every day. Some are violent and malicious, while others are little more than trivial. But no crime is as heavy or as devastating as those committed against children, innocent, defenseless, and unable to protect themselves. We recoil at the thought of anyone disturbed enough to harm a child. Yet this, too, happens every day. March 25th, 1993, Geauga County, Ohio. On a quiet stretch of Sidley Road in Thompson Township, 2 newspapers delivery women were making their rounds when they came across a strange-looking trash bag near the tree line. Believing it contained trash or discarded personals, the pair got out. They opened it carefully, and what they found horrified them. Inside was a newborn baby boy, lifeless and cold, wrapped in a white blanket. A neighboring county's coroner's office examined the body and discovered that the baby had been born alive, with its umbilical cord still attached. Judging by the graphic state of the child, animals had been eating on the body for some time. The nameless baby boy had scarcely taken his first breath before being abandoned to die in the woods, wrapped up like garbage and disposed of. Everyone was asking, what mother could do such a thing to their own child, and who, amongst them, had done it? The community in Geauga County, Ohio came together in support of the abandoned child. They organized a funeral, pulled together money for a headstone in Maple Grove Cemetery, and named him affectionately Geauga's baby. The headstone reads, "Geauga's child lies here now in safety, just too late. Too late to save his life. Too late to make things right, but not too late to teach us all to love and cherish life." This beautiful show of love and care made one thing very clear. The people would not rest until someone was held accountable. The investigation started off slow. Law enforcement canvassed the area, asking local residents about any pregnant women they'd seen, ones who suddenly no longer appeared pregnant. Neighbors gave their testimony, and each one was logged. Over the coming weeks, dozens of interviews would be conducted. While officers searched for an eyewitness, others checked with hospitals in the area for recent birth records, emergency visits, or if any recent patients had complications matching a home delivery. Unfortunately, none of the testimonies or medical records matched the facts of the case. There was even a thorough reinvestigation, where they reviewed the many tips they had received and reconfirmed suspects that had previously been exonerated, but nothing was concrete. No hard evidence could tie anyone to the Geauga's child. Every time they get a new lead, the lack of physical evidence would freeze up the investigation, and the case would again go cold. Between 1994 and the early 2000s, information continued to trickle in. More people came forward, believing they knew someone who may have secretly given birth. Each time the person was questioned, and each time they'd be let go, for a lack of any real evidence. Law enforcement was stumped. How do you catch a murderer with nothing to link potential suspects to the crime? Even if a woman had been in the area, had presumably been with a child, and had no baby to show for it, if the medical records didn't support her pregnancy, then everything afterwards was conjecture. They might have been able to request a medical examination, but without proper evidence, it'd be an invasion of privacy at best, and more likely, gross misconduct. In truth, they had no way of differentiating any one woman from any of the countless others. But they did have the child's DNA. By the mid-1990s, forensic DNA testing had become a more commonplace tool for investigators. At first, the methods were crude, requiring large, well-preserved samples of blood or tissue to get results. But with the child's remains, analysts were able to extract enough genetic material to begin building a profile. The key was short tandem repeats, otherwise abbreviated as STRs, microscopic patterns in the DNA or certain sequences repeated over and over again. While each human shares the same basic structure of DNA, the number of repeats at specific loci varies from person to person. By measuring these variations across multiple loci, forensic scientists could create a genetic fingerprint unique to the child. Using these specific methods, investigators built a foundation that was good enough to compare against potential relatives. If a suspected mother were identified later, her DNA could be tested against the Giagua's child to confirm or rule out maternity with a high degree of certainty. But they couldn't just wait and hope she would eventually get arrested. They had to look elsewhere. Over the next 5 years, law enforcement would compare the boy's DNA with emerging criminal databases. Local and state labs were already uploading and comparing DNA profiles of convicted criminals. If the mother or a close relative were ever arrested and their DNA logged, investigators would have a small chance to connect the dots. But this was a time-consuming process with a small pool of criminals. The likelihood of finding the mother, or really anyone related to the mother, was limited to the breadth of existing systems. Until 1998, when the federal government approved a system called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, conceived in 1990 by the FBI as a way to compare DNA samples across multiple states. CODIS was a groundbreaking new development in many cold cases. For the Giagua's child, this meant that his DNA could be compared with tens of thousands of those taken from convicted criminals, without the need to communicate between hundreds of districts. They began running the boy's DNA against nationwide data, and by 2017, a whopping 2 decades later, they had found nothing. Not a single match. Investigators were at a loss. After 20 years with no progress made, no new suspects, and no new information, it seemed like the Giagua's child might never get the justice he deserved. In order to solve this case, they would need a completely different approach. And by April 24th, 2018, the breakthrough they had been waiting for would take the world by storm. 2,500 miles away, another team of investigators had just solved one of the longest and most prolific cold cases in the country. They had just identified the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer was a serial burglar and murderer who terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s before vanishing into anonymity. For decades, his identity was a mystery until investigators turned to a new tool: genetic genealogy. By 2018, commercial genealogy had become a popular pastime, with websites like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and GED Match springing up all over the nation. And to use one of these websites, users would send in a DNA sample and get back a full genetic profile, as well as a detailed breakdown of their ancestral roots and potential relatives. Millions of people signed up out of curiosity, never realizing their family trees might one day help solve terrible crimes. Giagua County law enforcement were invigorated. They had no luck finding the mother who so long ago abandoned her baby boy to die. But maybe, just maybe, using the same commercial genealogy that caught Golden State, they could find a relative. The Giagua's child preserved DNA was submitted for advanced familial testing on a website called GED Match. After a couple of days, they finally made ground. Building a 1,400-person family tree, investigators discovered several genetic links pointing to distant relatives, third and fourth cousins scattered across the country. It wasn't the mother herself, but it was close enough to start drawing lines between families, building connections, branch by branch. After months of eliminating dead leads, all signs pointed to one: Gail Eastwood Ritchie, mother of the Giagua's child, had finally been arrested. Gail Eastwood, born in 1970, was regarded as a quiet, responsible woman. She was active in her church, helping to run their youth programs. Shockingly, she also worked as a local nanny. Upon her arrest, she gave the full story. Gail Eastwood had, for 9 months, hid her pregnancy from friends and family. No one knew she had ever been carrying, and when she gave birth, they were none the wiser. For 26 years, she kept a secret, continuing her life as normal. Eventually, she married, had another child, and raised a family. In interrogation, Gail admitted to her role in abandoning the boy and revealed information that would further disturb investigators. She confessed that the Giagua's baby was not the first child she had abandoned to die. There was another, 2 years earlier, who she had subjected to the same terrible fate. Though they couldn't find the remains of Gail Eastwood's first baby, and therefore couldn't charge her, it was a startling revelation that proved to be the final nail in the coffin at court. "I think you knew what to do because you'd done it before," Judge David Ondry told Ritchie during sentencing. "Calling you a monster who deserves life imprisonment is not an exaggeration." Gail Eastwood Ritchie was convicted by a jury in 2022 and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Later, an appeal was made, but it was turned down. The case of the Giagua's child is a haunting reminder of both the fragility of life and the relentless perseverance of those seeking justice. For decades, the boy's story remained a cold, unanswered question until science, ingenuity, and the persistence of all investigators involved finally brought the truth to light. While nothing can undo the terrible fate suffered by the Giagua's child, the resolution of this case ensured that his life, though brief, would not be forgotten, and that those who commit atrocities against children will be held accountable, no matter how many years pass. Dorothea Puente, the killer grandma. On a sunny city block in the heart of Sacramento, California, there lies a modest bungalow. Soft beige siding, neatly trimmed shrubs, a front porch loaded with flowering plants. It looks like the kind of place where neighbors nod politely and greet you with a smile. Friendly, almost appealing. Given how pedestrian the place looks, you might walk past it without a second glance. But sometimes, looks can be deceiving. You'd never know that the quaint little home was host to one of the most nauseating crimes in recent history. During the mid to late 80s, the residence served as a boarding home for elderly, mentally ill, or disabled tenants, run by caretaker and owner Dorothea Puente. Born Dorothea Helen Gray, Dorothea had a rough start in life. Her parents were both alcoholics, and for the short time they were responsible for her, she was systematically abused, until, at age 8, her father died of tuberculosis, followed shortly by her mother. Having no relatives willing to take care of her, Dorothea was sent to an orphanage. Here, she was SA'd. Dorothea kept a relatively low profile until 1960, when, at the age of 30, she was arrested for running a brothel in Sacramento. Over the next 2 decades, she would be married and remarried, taking the name of her first husband, Roberto Puente, who she met in Mexico City. Though she wasn't Hispanic herself, she became a beloved member of the Sacramento Hispanic community. She was known to host charitable events, offering hot meals and donated clothes to the less fortunate. She also frequently offered her services as a translator, helping Spanish speakers in court and with navigating social services. She was so beloved, in fact, her communal nickname was Dona Dorothea, or Madame Dorothea. To those who lived in her neighborhood, she served as something of a surrogate grandmother, kind, benevolent even, with a sweet smile and passive demeanor. But after her second marriage, things started to change behind the scenes. In the late 70s, Dorothea picked up a new hobby, one that did not align with her public persona. She frequented the local dive bars and clubs, but not to drink. She was looking for vulnerable men, old or disabled. She would befriend them, get to know them, and when they trusted her, she would forge their signature on disability checks to cash for herself. At the time, she was also working multiple jobs, first as a nurse's aide, then the manager of a boarding home. Here she had a large pool of vulnerable men to exploit, and she did, in excess. In 1978, Dorothea Puente was arrested and convicted of treasury fraud. She had been caught cashing 34 state and federal benefit checks that belonged to her elderly or disabled patients, friends, and old lovers. For the crime, she was sentenced to probation. Her probation came with strict stipulations. Chief among them, she was forbidden from owning or managing any boarding homes, working as a nurse or nurse's aide, or being in any position of authority over vulnerable adults. So, did Dorothea change her ways? Find a new line of work or a new tactic? To navigate around her parole, she turned her own house into a boarding home. Here, she could operate in complete secrecy. Her reputation as a caretaker preceded her, and with the result of her trial being fairly lax, with no real consequences, social workers were more than willing to place more difficult clients with Dorothea. Even if it meant breaking the law, they figured, what's the harm? She only received probation. How terrible could the crime have been? And furthermore, who would take care of these clients otherwise? These were very difficult clients, and who better to take care of them than the motherly, well-known Dorothea, who was not only willing to do so, but entirely capable and credible. On top of that, enforcement was lax. More serious crimes were being committed all across Sacramento, so with police needed elsewhere and high case loads for probation officers, Dorothea Puente continued to operate under the radar. In fact, she made a good living of it. So with all of this in mind, in February of 1988, when social workers needed to place a developmentally disabled client by the name of Alvaro Bert Montoya, they came to the woman they knew who would do the best job, Dorothea. Months later, police received reports of terrible smells emanating from her home. "We can't stand it," said neighbors. "There are a lot of flies in the area." The smell in question? Sickly sweet. A rotting smell. As more reports started to come in, social workers Judy Moyes and Jim Wilson were becoming worried. The man they had placed with Dorothea, Bert Montoya, hadn't been seen for some time. Community members too had questioned his whereabouts, but Dorothea explained it all away. He had gone to Mexico to visit relatives, or Bert just up and left. Social workers investigated, and in response, received a phone call from a suspicious man, claiming to be Montoya's brother-in-law, whose name was Michael Obregon. The man claimed he had transported Montoya himself and that he was in Mexico, safe and sound. Later, they received a letter confirming the narrative. But Judy Moyes, his social worker, was not convinced. She had worked with Bert for years and over that time had come to know him personally. He was a gentle and trusting man, but above all, he was routine-oriented. Suffering from a developmental disorder and schizophrenia, Bert relied on structure and contact to function. Bert would never up and leave. Not like this. The whole story was just too convenient. Moyes alerted law enforcement, and after the many complaints made by neighbors about the horrible smell of rotting meat, they arrived in full force to search the property and question Dorothea about her missing tenant, suspecting foul play. Dorothea welcomed them in, offered them tea. The inside of the house was spotless, clean and orderly. Nothing seemed aimless. When questioned about the horrible smell being reported by the neighbors, she claimed it was backed up sewage, but they didn't trust Dorothea. Something was off, so they questioned a resident, John Sharp. At first, when asked about Bert Montoya's whereabouts, John, who was scribbling on a piece of paper, claimed to have seen him 2 days earlier. He confirmed there was a smell like death emanating from the kitchen, but he didn't know the origin. Just as officers were finishing up their interview, John passed them a note. What it said left officers stunned. "She wants me to lie to you." And outside, something odd piqued their interest. There was upturned soil in her yard. Dorothea assured them that the upturned dirt was from gardening, planting flowers and shrubs, but it was too late. After cadaver dogs were alerted by the scent, police got permission to dig. A crowd gathered to watch the team of officers work in the hot California sun, shovels in hand, as they dug for answers. Soon enough, the whole neighborhood would know what was buried, down beneath the dirt. Sometime during the excavation, Dorothea requested to go down the road for something to drink. Police obliged, but she could only go with police supervision. She agreed, and they left for a walk. That's when Dorothea slipped away. 1 minute she was there, the next, gone. While officers frantically searched for Dorothea, police back at the residence had unearthed a truly grisly scene. A body, wrapped in a linen cloth. Judging by the decay, it had been there for some time. They had found the source of the sickening smell neighbors had been reporting for months, but there was a problem. It was a woman's body. Whoever it was they had just found, it wasn't Bert Montoya. At the house, law enforcement had accidentally stumbled across an execution site. And where they dug? A mass grave. After some more excavation, they found Bert Montoya's body. Then another. And another. With every corpse exhumed, the truth became disgustingly clear. Dorothea Puente wasn't a murderer. She was a serial killer. In total, 7 bodies were found in the backyard of the house, belonging to people Dorothea was asked to care for, and the government thought they were still alive, because Dorothea was collecting their social security checks. Later, toxicology showed that, sometime after their arrival at the boarding home, Dorothea would overdose especially vulnerable tenants with a combination of sedatives and prescription drugs. Afterwards, she would bury them. The victims were later identified as Leona Carpenter, who was 78 years old, Benjamin Fink, who was 55 years old, James Gallup, who was 62, Vera Faye Martin, who was 64, Dorothy Miller, who was 64, Betty Mae Palmer, 78, and Alvaro Bert Montoya, who was 52 years old. On top of the 7 victims buried in the yard, Dorothea was implicated for 2 more deaths: Ruth Monroe, her former business partner, and Everson Gilmouth, a former lover. But in order to charge her, they had to find her. Police coordinated with neighboring counties, local bus and train stations, and even motels, trying to track her movements. News outlets plastered her face across newspapers and television screens, asking the public for any information on the dangerous woman named Dorothea Puente. Tips flooded in from concerned citizens. Some claimed sightings at bus terminals, others reporting her in Los Angeles under an assumed name. Every lead was followed, every alley checked, until finally, days after she vanished, Dorothea was located. Ironically, in a small Los Angeles boarding home. Calm and composed as ever, she was taken into custody without incident. On the morning of November 17th, 1988, she was flown back to Sacramento. At trial, Dorothea's defense focused on her age, demeanor, and public benevolence. Her lawyers argued that she couldn't have killed these people, and the deaths were either accidental or from natural causes. Prosecutors had a different take. They portrayed a predatory woman with a long history of fraud who manipulated the system, deceived the public, and eliminated her victims for personal gain. They encouraged the jury to pursue the death penalty for her crimes. Reportedly, while her many crimes were being showcased, the jury was baffled by the contrast between her unintimidating demeanor and the horrific nature of the crimes. Because of this, when it came time to deliberate on the verdict, the jury deadlocked on multiple counts. For this reason, on August 26, 1993, Dorothea Puente was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Leona Carpenter, Benjamin Fink, and James Gallup. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dorothea Puente spent the remainder of her life in prison, where she died in 2011 at the age of 82 years old. Her arrest and conviction brought long overdue justice to her victims and highlighted the serious gaps in the oversight of vulnerable adults, prompting changes in social services and regulations about boarding homes. While her crimes were horrific, the case ultimately strengthened protections for the elderly and the disabled. ensuring that future generations would hopefully be safe from further exploitation by monsters like Dorothea Puente. And alright guys, that wraps up some disturbing true crime cases. Would you like to see another video like this in the future? If so, please comment down below and like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Thank you so much for watching. This was Snook, and I'll see you next time. Bye.